Tonight on Stay Tuned, we're taking a brief, but we believe important, detour from the dominating news story right now to talk about something that a lot of people would say is not getting nearly enough attention, especially when you consider the millions of people it affects and the trillion-dollar cost it's projected to have for our country. We're talking about Alzheimer's, and tonight's conversation is also timely. There's an important piece of filmmaking on this subject set to debut here on the 9 Network, and there is some potentially groundbreaking research on this deadly disease happening right here in St. Louis. Joining us in the studio, Lisa Barron, the founder and executive director of Memory Care Home Solutions. Stacy Tulavaz, the president of the St. Louis chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. Dr. Bo Ansis, a professor of neurology at Washington University, and Dr. George Grossberg, a professor of psychiatry and geriatric psychiatrist at St. Louis University. Alzheimer's diagnoses are set to skyrocket in this country, and as the film says, every minute counts in the search for a cure. So we hope you'll stay tuned. Stay Tuned brings together local experts, journalists, civic leaders, and regular people to have tough conversations for a stronger St. Louis. Add your voice to our conversation, and you're at the table as we stay on top of current events and go deeper, bringing more light and less heat to the issues that matter. From the 9 Network of Public Media in Grand Center, this is Stay Tuned.
Every day, every night, all across America, families in crisis are reaching out for help.
Just so sad seeing a person wither away like this.
He shouldn't be driving, but he does. There's no getting the keys away from him.
He's diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's is the biggest epidemic we have in this country.
It's a crisis coming down the pike that you can see.
She is combative and difficult.
I don't want it to escalate anymore, to get any more violent.
Alzheimer's is an epic disease. There's the case every single minute in this country and every 4 seconds around the world.
It affects all of us. Your family, a friend, your neighbor.
This is one of the top 6 things that's going to kill us.
I'm taking care of her now almost 10 years from her first diagnosis.
She thinks I'm her mother. Our roles are reversed. So what do I do?
I'm shocked that people are not panicked about what this disease is going to do to the country or to their families.
It's going to sink the healthcare economy and in turn sink the national economy.
He's just like, who am I? I don't understand.
It will take us down. This disease will take us down.
We have a chance to avoid that. But to do so, we have to fund the research to find the cure. It's a race against time.
That's Every Minute Counts, and it'll premiere on the 9 Network here on 9 PBS Wednesday, January 25th at 9 p.m. And we were all just sitting here saying that it looks powerful, and it is, having seen the amount we've been able to see so far. The audio calls that you heard right there, those are recordings into a hotline with people who have questions. And some very basic questions, some very difficult questions. But let's just start with some basics. What exactly is this disease? What exactly do we know how it does what it does to the brain? I'll start over here, I suppose.
I could maybe start off and we can both talk about it. So the key question about this progressive brain disease is why cells die in Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is, as I mentioned, a disorder that affects neurons or brain cells, that affects memory, affects judgment, affects personality, affects behavior, really robs the individual of their individuality in a progressive fashion, and eventually they get to a point where they become totally dependent on caregivers, bedridden, need to be fed, and so on. So it's a horrible disease. As I think you'll hear from the others, one of the leading causes of mortality or death in the United States, and is going to be by far the most expensive disease as far as caregiving costs, bar none, in the U.S. and worldwide.
Who does it affect? Are we seeing it more, or are we just getting older and living longer, or is it advancing in some other way?
We think that, if you look at the estimates and how things are going to be progressing by the year 2050, I mean, the numbers are going to be staggering, and the bills and the costs to not only the individual but also the caregivers are just going to be astronomical, and that's going to really hit us because it's almost a tsunami. We're starting to see the first wave that's starting to come, and with the baby boomers aging, it's just going to be more and more.
And so who does it affect?
Well, families and caregivers, and you're going to see this in the documentary. You see the story of Daisy Duarte and caring for her mother, Sonia. And so we know that there are 5 million individuals with Alzheimer's disease, but with each person there's at least 3 caregivers because of the devastation and the duration of the disease. It's significant. That's what you're going to see.
It multiplied, the effects are multiplied out. Let's take a look at another clip from the movie and talk about what it highlights on the other side of it.
And I can't find my car keys.
I don't think you have a car anymore, Grandma. I think
What happened to it?
I think the engine blew up.
Oh, really?
Mom has been unpredictable. It's probably an understatement.
It's awful.
Probably goes back 5-10 years. I think we started noticing the repeating at that time it's probably 10 minutes. She'd come back and ask the same question.
My car's out in the garage, isn't it?
No, you don't have the car anymore. The engine blew up.
When did that happen?
Oh, a while ago.
Oh, was
It seems like more recently it's been not even a minute.
Where's my car?
It's through.
Mom?
What?
Mom, I just brought over dinner. Get a bite to eat. We'll find your purse.
How could I lose a purse in this house?
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And it's amazing the number of unpaid caregivers, family members who are there. There are 15 million unpaid caregivers. Over half of the people with dementia are being cared for by someone at home. These are people like my family who found themselves in the caregiving role, were educated, have resources, and had absolutely no idea how to handle constant repetition. Difficult questions that are frustrating. And so Memory Care Home Solutions is a service that comes out to people's homes, goes into their homes, and sees what are the most difficult issues with which you are dealing now. And it's totally free of charge.
Even even just watching 20 seconds of a clip, it can be, gosh, I hate to say it, it can be frustrating. And I'm sure that that's a hard place to be.
So I had a family tell me about, so the helpline that you mentioned earlier, that's the Alzheimer's Association's helpline. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Anytime you want to call, any place you can call and we'll answer any question. But one of the callers called in and said, I wish that I would have called you earlier. I wish I would have called you before the dark days. And I said, well, what were the dark days? And she said, before the disease took over from Mother, if I had known about how to communicate and how to work with her, and I would have enjoyed those few precious moments I had left.
Because it looks like also though a lonely place, that was Rick in the film there, that looks like a lonely place that he can be in or the caregiver can be in.
I really think that the services that we're talking about more than anything else, it's that we provide solace to the caregiver who feels, like you said, alone, and that they're the only ones who are dealing with this. And just to provide a network, a lifeline to people is huge. Whether it's on the phone, going into their home, support group, it's all needed.
Yeah, I was going to just add, as a physician who diagnoses and treats Alzheimer's patients, works with their families every day, we are very, very fortunate in St. Louis to have the resources that these two individuals represent. One of the strongest chapters of the Alzheimer's Association nationally, with amazing programs that are being replicated everywhere else that originated here. And then Memory Care Home Solutions, I don't think anyone else is doing exactly what you're doing. I think they're great services. The problem is a lot of doctors don't know about these services and they don't refer. So I think one of the things the show will do is hopefully make people more aware of the services that you provide, including physicians.
Is there a physical toll on the caregiver too?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and you need to, and in the show, when I see Daisy and I see Sonia, I actually have to tell Daisy to take a break because it's a 24/7 They're constantly taking care of that loved one, and they need some downtime. And I say you have to find ways where you can take a break, because if you're not strong, you can't be strong for the patient as well too. And what you're seeing is that they need a team environment. It's both the physicians as well as a support team. So it's not just the individual, him or herself, it's everyone around that can buff up and support this individual.
Let's meet the women you're talking about in the film.
Unlike most people with Alzheimer's, Sonia is young. She's only 60 years old. She has a rare form of the disease caused by a genetic mutation that runs in families. And that meant that Daisy herself faced an excruciating decision.
Once my mom got the mutation, I had a 50-50 chance of having it, and no one was going to stop me. I just wanted to know. When I was going to give the blood for the testing, I told my mom to stay with one of my friends, and she's like, why? And I said, Ma, I'm going to go get blood work. You stay here, and I'll be back. Huh? At that time, she was talking very little. She's like, it's okay. You're not sick. And she kissed me on my forehead, and I went on my way.
We'll leave it there. It's a powerful film, and you'll want to see what happens in the following scenes there. But there's a lot to kind of unpack there. First, let's just start with how they started. The age of her mother. She was young. She's only 60. Help us understand that. What are you seeing, and how is that changing? What should we know?
I think it's relatively uncommon. So probably 95% of the patients that we see do not have this genetic mutation, or do not have early onset, usually under the age of 60, or familial Alzheimer's disease. But we have plenty of them, unfortunately, and they are, in my practice, the most tragic patients because, again, they're young, they're in the prime of life, and this horrible brain disease hits them. And also, of course, the caregiver, who I've often talked about as the second patient. One of the things I'm trying to educate doctors about is that if you have an Alzheimer's patient in your practice, whatever their age, you never have just one patient. You have at least two. And you need to pay attention to that second patient, the primary caregiver, at least 50% rate of significant depression, 20 to 30% rates of anxiety and burnout. And as you pointed out very nicely, if something happens to the caregiver, they can't help that patient anymore. So it's in our best interest to really see two patients, the caregiver as well as the identified individual. But the younger individual is relatively uncommon. Maybe you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, so she has a very rare form of this disease, and really, when I saw them, it was the diagnosis of talking about the family. And when you go and you start talking to the family and you start figuring out that the uncles, the aunts, a number of other people have this, then that starts putting it into a perspective, and that actually was the way to make the diagnosis and actually crack the case of what was going on. They came in actually with a totally different diagnosis when they initially saw me. So you have to be thinking, you have to be actually on the lookout for some of these kinds of patients because they will present, and they will present at an earlier age.
So if it's rare, but the genetic, the mutation could provide what? The work that you're doing could lead to what?
Right, so we're doing trials, and specifically WashU is going to be, and it is the leader of doing these kinds of trials that are not just nationally, they're internationally, because as you heard, it's a very rare form, so we have to go scour the whole world to find these kinds of cases. And what they are they're telling us what's going to happen. So when we see Sonia, and then now we see Daisy, we can start to see what's going to happen to them in the future. So we already know that in X number of years, this individual could develop these symptoms, and we can start to track the disease. Because we know when a person walks into the clinic and they're getting diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, they didn't have it yesterday, and now they developed it today. It's a slow process. It's about 15 to 20 years, and we're now starting to see, and we're able to detect these changes much earlier in the disease.
Is the knowledge that we're hearing, that we're talking about here, is that commonly known to the folks as they first discover they're dealing with this disease in their family or themselves?
What I was going to piggyback on regarding the age of caregivers and care receivers is that we're seeing over the 15 years that Memory Care Home Solutions has been in existence, younger people are reaching out for help. So we are seeing the baby boomers.
For themselves.
For themselves and for their parents.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. So 15 years ago, it was often the 80-year-old spouse who was calling. Now it's really the 60-year-old daughter. It's the people who are more tech savvy, the people who can, they don't have as many issues around denial, and they realize they really need help, and they call, and they say, come see my family now. There's no diagnosis necessary. They just have to realize we're in trouble. Something is wrong. Mom's not acting the same way she was 2 years ago, 10 years ago.
The 60-year-old patient, as you pointed out, is pretty rare.
Yes. Right. This is a caregiver.
Yes.
Pretty rare, but they still, it's even finding the services, to her point, 15, 20, 25 years ago, they weren't coming to our door. And now they are coming, and so we got to figure out what to do with them. So we have support groups. We have support groups for early stage Alzheimer's. That's very different than the 85-year-old's experience. They're dealing with work, children at home. It's a very different experience, and we're all having to rise up and respond to that changing kind of diversity.
We talked a little bit about in the intro and in the clip earlier about the cost of this disease on Medicare, Medicaid. Are there resources for people available that are we as a society putting resources towards the care of these folks?
Well, I'll say one thing. First of all, 70% of Americans think that Medicare is going to pay for long-term care, and it's simply not true. So that's terrifying, that people are thinking, I'm going to be okay if I need long-term care, and so many people will need long-term care. So that's terrifying. So yes, to answer your question, we need to continue to pour more and more resources into this. And we're having some luck with the federal government, certainly on the research side, and getting some funding put to that. I think we're not necessarily seeing the dollars come forth in the community-based services that we'd like to see. But the research side, we saw some movement, still not enough.
There needs to be more. I mean, if you look at the numbers of what is funded, so, you know, if you think about with Alzheimer's disease, it's the 6th most leading common diagnosis and cause of death in the United States.
Well, let's look at the numbers. That's an excellent setup. We're going to put you in charge of the show. This is another clip from the movie.
As with every major health threat, money for basic research on Alzheimer's comes primarily from the federal government. But for many years, that funding was significantly lower than for other diseases.
If you look at the top 10 diseases of how people die, Alzheimer's disease is the only one where there are no survivors and there is nothing we can do to prevent it or stop the progress of the disease. In all other cases, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, HIV, stroke, in all these cases, there are ways to get survivors, to slow down the disease, or even prevent it early on.
The NIH spends over $5 billion a year on cancer research, spends $3 billion on HIV/AIDS research, spends $2 billion a year on cardiovascular research. Those are all really good things, and we've made progress. Breast and prostate cancer deaths are down. HIV/AIDS deaths are down by over 50%. Heart disease, the #1 killer in America, deaths are down. Unfortunately, we have not made a similar investment in Alzheimer's disease research. Since 2000, the deaths from Alzheimer's have gone up 71%.
Just a couple of, that was directly to the point you were saying. So the solution is, or is the solution coming?
We hope, but it's a tough nut to crack because it is a very complicated disease. As you're hearing, there are multiple changes that are going on in the brain. It's not simple, and it's not going to be an easy process. But we've made a lot of gains, but we need to even make more gains. And if you look at the numbers, and probably what they'll talk in the show is that for cancer, there's 10 times more funding for cancer than there is for Alzheimer's disease. There is still a wide gap. We're making improvements, but a large gap exists, and we're trailing. We gotta catch up. We haven't gotten there yet.
So I was going to say, I think an interesting development in Alzheimer's research has been the notion that we don't really understand why we've had so many failures of promising therapies. We don't know if maybe these new medications that have failed in trials, one after the other, have failed because mechanistically they don't work, because this isn't this amyloid, this proteinaceous material that gunks up the neurons, causes the brain cells to die, isn't really the core cause of Alzheimer's disease, or whether that may be in fact the core cause, but our methodology has not been correct. We're not giving these treatments or providing these treatments early enough. So one of the things that we're starting now, in fact in the next month, is a study called the EARLY study, which is not for people with Alzheimer's disease. It's for those 60-year-old adult children or siblings who don't have any evidence of the disease, but there may be on some sophisticated brain imaging, PET scans, maybe early evidence that that plaque process has started, but they're fully functional. It's a 10-year study. And we're hoping by giving these amyloid-based therapies very early to these vulnerable individuals, we may be able to prevent or delay the onset, but we don't know.
And that's what, so a variation of that is what Daisy and Sonia are in. So they're in a study called the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network, led at WashU internationally that we were talking about before. There are actually 3 different compounds that they could be potentially get therapy. And what you're hearing now is this is a total shift. We are now going to earlier and earlier diagnosis and earlier treatment. And so the idea is we're now in the prevention game. We're trying to delay, we're trying to make an earlier diagnosis and halt it and push it over for a number of years. And if we can do that, that can make a huge difference. It can make a better quality of life for the individual, for the caregivers, for everybody, and they can have a more enjoyable life as well.
It sounds like there's just a lot we don't know. Is that fair?
That's fair. And you know, one thing we don't know, St. Louisans don't know that we're sitting at the epicenter of worldwide research. You're looking at, you know, St. Louis University and Washington University. So it's, I will say this about them. We're at the epicenter of that. We're at the middle of the first prevention study that's ever occurred. And we've got things that are going on that nobody else has going. We're really proud that here in St. Louis, our chapter certainly realized that, and so we're proud that we were part of funding Diane and getting it. $4 million is really a drop in the bucket when research goes, but we were there to be a part of getting it jump-started through grassroots. When the big dollars, the research dollars at NIH, they hadn't loosened up their dollars yet, and now that's come, and we've got 26 million, but still not enough. So that's an example of where the grassroots research can help make this, you know, go forward. But the people don't know that St. Louis is sitting right in the epicenter of research.
I guess if a person has Alzheimer's, they can't really lobby for themselves either. They can't necessarily make a trip to Washington and hold a rally.
Right. I had the great fortune of being invited to speak before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging on behalf of caregivers. And one of the most exciting things about that opportunity was that the Senate wanted to hear about the plight of caregivers. It wasn't just about research dollars and finding a cure, because before there's a cure, there's care. When people with Alzheimer's go into the hospital, they spend an average of 9.3 days in the hospital. When someone of the same age without dementia goes in, they spend an average of 3.3 days. So it'll be wonderful to find the cure, but before then, let's help families who are in the homes know how to deal with dehydration and know how to deal with bed sores and constant repetition, so they can take care of it at home, decrease the costs for the hospital, for the public and private sector. And that's what our program's been able to do.
Again, because the patient just, like, they can't go to Washington on their own behalf. They can't advocate for themselves and even tell the doctor what's wrong in some cases, I guess.
Great point. And I think that one of the things that's really critical is because there is not screening going on in many hospitals or with emergency room or advanced practice paramedics, there is training going on for someone who may not be able to actually employ it. So we are actually involved in a partnership in which we're helping to help screen with the emergency room and with the advanced practice paramedics at Christian Hospital, so that they can know who can actually benefit from this sort of training and give that instruction to a caregiver so that they can implement it.
I was going to say that related to your comment about Alzheimer's patients not being able to advocate for themselves, which is a huge issue and one of the reasons why I think we don't have as much in the way of research dollars as other diseases do, is also the notion that before we called this Alzheimer's disease, it was called senility. We didn't really understand it, but it was Alzheimer's disease, but we called it senility.
Something that just happened when you got old.
Right, and not only that, but there's a stigma of senility is a mental illness. There was a stigma of mental illness. So even families were not as upfront about saying that my mom or dad is senile or has senile dementia. So even with Alzheimer's disease being a bit more of a scientific term, we now use major neurocognitive disorder. We don't use dementia even anymore because that's thought to be derogatory. Things are changing. but not as much as with other diseases where the patient herself or himself can go and lobby and say, I've got horrible diabetes. Look at my leg. It was cut off last year. It was
can't breathe. I've got
amputated.
pain in my
I
arm.
can't breathe because I got emphysema. Look at this mask I got to wear all the time. That is traumatic. Alzheimer's patients themselves can't do that.
But you also need to think of also the context of the community. We're still not getting into enough other communities. In particular, in the African American communities, we really need to make further strides into that. They're starting to occur. You're starting to see working through churches, working through other organizations, working through YMCAs, working through the Alzheimer's Association, and they're doing fantastic work here. We need to do this because there are certain cultural customs and norms that you've been hearing about that people have kind of just said, oh, that's normal aging. If I get a little bit more impaired, that's nothing. That's what it should be. It shouldn't be. People need to be looking out, need to be screening, need to be thinking, and need to get into those communities because you're going to see it. It's an untapped area of African Americans.
And if it's associated with mental health, that we've talked about that on this show before in different communities, that has a stigma that is even stronger in some places.
Think about Alzheimer's disease. All of its symptoms are mental. The number one reason for Alzheimer's patients ending up in a nursing home is behaviors, safety issues and behaviors that the family can no longer deal with. And those are not easy. Anything mental, okay, is difficult to deal with. And you know how much discrimination we have in our society, unfortunately, against things that are mental. And I agree with you 1,000% about the unmet needs in the minority communities, whether it's the aging Latino community in the city of St. Louis. With the Alzheimer's Association's help, we're hoping to set up clinics in North St. Louis for African Americans. A lot of unmet needs.
And a lot of work still to be done.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. Lisa Barron, Stacy Tulavaz, and Dr. George Grossberg, and Dr. Bo Ansis. Thank you all for all of your time. And don't forget, next week, January 25th at 9 p.m.,